For decades, scientists have quietly monitored one of the most powerful and mysterious forces shaping our climate, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It is not something most people have ever heard of, but it plays a critical role in regulating temperatures, weather systems, and ocean life around the globe. Recently, new studies have sparked a wave of concern, with some researchers warning that we could be dangerously close to pushing this system past a breaking point. One high-profile study suggested that a complete collapse could occur at some point between the years 2025 and 2095. While the estimate spans decades, the central warning is clear: the risk is growing faster than expected. This video is a hypothetical look at what would happen if the AMOC actually shut down, what the science tells us, how it might unfold over time, and the kind of world that could emerge in its wake. It is important to understand that this is not a prediction. It is a model based on current data and climate projections. But if the collapse ever happens, it would reshape life on Earth in ways we are only beginning to understand. What follows is a possible timeline of that disaster, a step-by-step breakdown of a planetary-scale tipping point that for now still lies just ahead. The AMOC does not crash overnight. It weakens slowly until a point is reached where it can no longer hold its structure. The earliest signs of failure are already being observed. Scientists have documented a steady decline in AMOC strength since at least the mid-20th century. In fact, recent data suggest it is now at its weakest point in over 1,000 years. This weakening is linked to several accelerating processes, including the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. As fresh water pours into the North Atlantic, it disrupts the salinity-driven engine that keeps the AMOC moving. In the first few years of a collapse scenario, strange and extreme weather patterns would begin to emerge. Winters in Western Europe, particularly in countries like the United Kingdom, Ireland, and France, would become colder and longer, even as the rest of the world continues to heat up. At the same time, parts of West Africa and South America could begin to suffer severe droughts. The Amazon rainforest, already under stress, would receive far less rain, increasing the risk of wildfires and ecosystem collapse. The monsoon systems that support farming in South Asia would weaken unpredictably, threatening the food supply for billions. Coastal areas in the southeastern United States would experience rapid sea level rise, up to 30 centimeters in just a few years, caused by the loss of water circulations pushing against the Atlantic coast. These early signals would seem disconnected at first, but together they would mark the irreversible unraveling of the AMOC. As the AMOC continues its breakdown, the weather patterns across the planet begin to shift in dramatic and chaotic ways. Once the current drops below a certain threshold, the climate system enters a state of sharp imbalance. North America and Europe are among the first to feel it. In eastern Canada and the northeastern United States, winters become brutally cold, with Arctic air diving further south and lingering for months. Summers, meanwhile, grow shorter and stormier, with abnormal rainfall patterns ruining crops and flooding cities. In Europe, the shift is even more jarring. The Gulf Stream, once responsible for keeping Western Europe relatively mild, no longer delivers warmth from the tropics. Places like Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom begin to resemble regions far closer to the Arctic Circle. Snow becomes more common, and average temperatures plummet by several degrees Celsius within a matter of years. Entire growing seasons vanish, and staple crops like wheat and barley suffer major reductions. Agricultural output in Europe declines sharply, triggering food shortages that hit vulnerable populations the hardest. But it's not just Europe and North America. In South America, the rainfall that once nourished the Amazon basin shifts dramatically. Vast sections of the rainforest begin to die off, releasing stored carbon into the atmosphere and accelerating global warming even further. In West Africa, the Sahel region, already arid, turns into a near-total desert, driving mass migration and regional instability. Across South Asia, the weakening of the Indian monsoon becomes a permanent fixture, disrupting agriculture for nations that rely heavily on it, such as India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Globally, the growing unpredictability of temperature, rain, and storm patterns creates a condition known as climate whiplash, where extreme weather swings back and forth in ways that society cannot adapt to fast enough. This is the stage where panic begins to replace denial. As climate chaos intensifies, the pressure on global food systems becomes unbearable. Once stable regions struggle with shortened growing seasons, soil erosion from increased rainfall, and sweltering heat waves that decimate crops before they reach harvest. In the United States, the Corn Belt becomes unreliable, with corn and soybean yields dropping year after year. In Southeast Asia, rice paddies flood or dry up with no warning. Farming becomes a gamble with increasingly long odds. The collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation doesn't just cool the northern hemisphere, it also drives intense sea level rise along eastern coastlines. When the AMOC weakens, it causes water to pile up along shores from Boston to Miami. Cities like New York, Charleston, and Norfolk face sea level increases that are up to 10 inches higher than the global average. These numbers might not seem large, but the effect is catastrophic. Storm surges that used to come once a century now happen every decade. Drainage systems fail, basements flood regularly, and coastal infrastructure begins to corrode and collapse under the pressure of repeated high tides and saltwater intrusion. In the tropics, the redistribution of heat triggers more supercharged hurricanes and typhoons. These storms grow slower, wetter, and more destructive, lingering longer over cities and unleashing catastrophic flooding. In places like the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and parts of the Western Pacific, entire communities are abandoned after being hit multiple times in a single decade. Insurance companies withdraw, governments run out of disaster relief funds, and rebuilding is no longer seen as feasible. At this point, international markets begin to buckle. Food imports grind to a halt in countries already reliant on them. Grain shortages lead to skyrocketing prices. Livestock industries collapse. The cost of dairy, meat, bread, and vegetables hits levels that make them inaccessible to large swaths of the population. And with more and more farmland compromised or lost entirely, there is no easy fix. What was once a climate crisis has evolved into a cascading global food emergency, triggered not by war or disease, but by the disappearance of a crucial ocean current that once held the planet in balance. In the aftermath of an Atlantic meridional overturning circulation shutdown, the world does not return to normal. Instead, it enters a new climate state, a permanent, unpredictable instability that affects every ecosystem, economy, and civilization on Earth. The familiar seasonal patterns that guided agriculture and migration for thousands of years break apart. Weather becomes erratic and extreme, with cold snaps in tropical regions and blistering heat waves in areas that once saw snow. It is not just the temperature that changes, but the very rhythm of the natural world. In Europe, the collapse of the AMOC transforms the landscape. Countries like the United Kingdom, Ireland, and parts of Scandinavia grow significantly colder and wetter. Harsh winters reduce the viability of crops and strain energy infrastructure. In North Africa and parts of the Middle East, the opposite occurs. Temperatures spike and fresh water disappears entirely, accelerating already dire drought conditions. Populations are forced to move inland or toward higher elevations, but the areas left are often already overcrowded or unsustainable. Globally, ecosystems unravel. Coral reefs, already suffering from ocean acidification and warming, vanish entirely in many regions. With their disappearance comes the collapse of fish stocks that billions of people rely on for protein. Arctic wildlife, such as polar bears and seals, lose critical sea ice habitat, while boreal forests in Canada and Russia ignite in larger and more frequent wildfires. Biodiversity plummets. Insect populations that are essential for pollination crash. The food chain itself begins to fracture. Politically, the world fractures along climate fault lines. Nations that still possess habitable zones guard them with increasing militarization. Climate refugees, potentially numbering in the hundreds of millions, move across continents in search of stability, only to encounter closed borders and humanitarian crises. New alliances form not around ideology, but around access to land, water, and food. International institutions struggle to keep pace with the scale of displacement and suffering. Cooperation becomes rare, and conflict becomes routine. By now, the AMOC shutdown is no longer just a scientific concern, it is a defining chapter in human history. The transformation of the planet is irreversible within human lifetimes. Efforts at geoengineering or carbon removal come too late to reverse the disruption. This is not extinction, but evolution under duress. The species that survive, humans included, must now adapt to a world they never prepared for. Cities will be rebuilt in new places, crops will be engineered to tolerate extremes, but the familiar Earth, the one humans built civilization upon, is gone. The future, if it exists, belongs to those who learn to live with less certainty, less stability, and less control. Because the collapse of the AMOC was not a freak event. It was the result of choices, millions of them made over decades. And now the world must live with the consequences, one storm, one drought, and one migration at a time.